The Ukrainians always say thank you. And I actually would say, well, we should be thanking them. They are the ones that are, protecting us. They are the front line, and we see what Russia is doing, what we still call hybrid warfare.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. My guest today, Thordis Gylfadottir, served as Iceland's foreign minister until 2024. We spoke last week at the Aspen Security Forum, where she delivered a forceful case for the necessity of continued military and diplomatic support for Ukraine. However, that view, once broadly shared across Europe and the Atlantic, is no longer as ubiquitous as it once was. In our conversation, I wanted to learn exactly how firm support for Ukraine remains across Europe, both in politics and society, and what, if anything, can be done to shore up that support. We begin, however, with a discussion of her current work as the Special Envoy for the Council of Europe on the situation of children in Ukraine, where she helps bring home Ukrainian children kidnapped by Russia during the invasion. Now here is my conversation with Thordis Gylfadottir, former foreign minister of Iceland. Thordis, thank you so much for speaking with me live from the Aspen Security Forum. I really appreciated your remarks on stage last night, and we'll get there. I want to have a wide-ranging conversation with you about your perceptions on the conflict in Ukraine, as well as what you perceive to be broader European perspectives on the conflict. But I wanted to kick off with something that you were, I think, not able to discuss last night by virtue of time, which is your role as a special envoy for Ukrainian children. It's somewhat, I believe, receded in memory at this point, but among the horrors visited upon the Ukrainian population was the enforced disappearance and kidnapping at scale of Ukrainian children, a crime for which both Vladimir Putin and one of his ministers, Maria Lvova-Belova, was indicted by the International Criminal Court. Can you just describe where things stand on that front right now and what efforts are being made to reunite these children with their families?
As you mentioned, nobody really knows how many Ukrainian children have been stolen. From the Ukrainian side, they have a list of 19,500 names, down to names. We also know that Yale is tracking 35,000 children in Russia in 116 locations. But what we also know is if you take into account the temporarily occupied territories, you have combined 1.6 million children. And there's not a lot of knowledge on their situation within these areas. So, of course, for me as a special envoy within the Council of Europe, it's limited what we can, literally do in bringing them back. The Council of Europe kicked Russia out after the full-scale war of aggression. But we know that there have been around 1,400 children that have been brought back through various different paths. What we see, and is important for everyone to know, is that this is clear priority of Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, First Lady, and this is always mentioned as non-negotiable part of any form of peace, that those children will be brought back to their motherland. This is being done very strategic and systematic.
Could you walk us through the really horrific situation and circumstances in which these children became essentially kidnapped by Russia And what do you perceive to be Russia's strategic logic in kidnapping so many children at scale?
The narrative that they want us to believe is that this was done out of charity, that there were children that were evacuated from a not secure situation, often children without parents, guardians in institutions. But the reality is that the children came from very different situation. I've met children that have been brought back to Ukraine. Some of them I've met, with their mothers. And the stories are horrific and almost unreal, through different areas in Ukraine where, for example, a woman was taken, and when she escaped or was released, her children was gone and they had been stolen. And the children that have been brought back, some through, different measures. There are many NGOs within Ukraine doing a remarkable job every day. Save Ukraine and so many others. Bring Kids Back UA, which is part of the president's office, is doing an amazing job. And we have also third countries that are assisting. There are, basically mediators between both sides. And there, Qatar is the country that has done the most. So this is what we know, and both when we hear stories from the children that are being brought back, but also what we know by the tracking, is that they are forbidden to speak their mother language. They are forced to speak Russian. Some of them are indoctrinated. So the goal is also to basically send them in the nearest future to the front lines to attack their own motherland. They are brainwashed. And, this is history repeating itself. And that's why I say this is the clearest, I would say, symbolic and clearest example of the fact that the war in Ukraine is a test of everything we stand for. And how we tackle that and how we assist Ukraine to be able to bring the children back is a fundamental thing. And there is no possibility to talk about any form of just peace without these children being brought back.
I'm glad you mentioned the notion of a just peace in Ukraine because, this is now my fourth Aspen Security Forum. And I recall 2022, a few months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was just broad support here, bipartisan support here in the United States. And this is a very bipartisan forum. And you saw members of Congress from both the left and right effusively praising Zelensky and committing themselves to supporting Ukraine. But a year later, that was not the case. A year later, I remember there's a panel of members of Congress, and you start to see fissures in what was that broad bipartisan support. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of you as a government official in Iceland, over the course of the conflict, have you seen an erosion of popular support for the defense of Ukraine among Icelanders, which, is culturally European, not part of the European Union, but also geographically isolated? So have you seen a same sort of diminution of support?
I would say that, we have the vast majority of the population that fully supports Ukraine and see this as there are not many things in a very complicated world that are black and white. But this is, I would say, comes very close to it. You have, a military superpower invading their neighbor, a sovereign and independent neighbor that did nothing else than, pursuing a more prosperous, more fair, liberal society that protects fundamental human rights and wants to be a part of the transatlantic family. One of the things that have been quite controversial in Iceland, and was a decision that I made as a Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defense, was that Iceland also supported Ukraine with defense-related support. Of course, we cannot send any weapons because we just don't have them. We are the only NATO country that doesn't have a standing military, but we did so. And that was controversial. That does not have majority of support in Iceland that we do it. But for me, it was a principled position that sometimes it's not enough to do your best. You just have to do what is required. And, if we were invaded, we would not only ask for blankets. We would need more support than that. So what we see, I think in the other Nordic countries, of course it changes and people get tired. You can normalize a lot. But in the Nordic countries, there is a huge support, and the political leaders have, I would say, shown courage, and they've been very frank and honest about why it's important to support Ukraine. And I think even though the support is in many countries decreasing a bit, I think on the other hand, there is an increased understanding that what we've been saying since the beginning, that this war is not only about Ukraine. And that is why I said last night, the Ukrainians always say thank you. And I actually would say, well, we should be thanking them. They are the ones that are, protecting us. They are the front line, and we see what Russia is doing, what we still call hybrid warfare, in so many member states of NATO, with all sorts of hybrid warfare, where they are testing how far can they go. We also hear how they speak about other NATO members, for example, the Baltic states. And what Ukraine is fighting for, which I also mentioned last night, and I think it's important for us to understand, because that if we truly understand that, it does change how we look at this war of aggression. They are not only fighting for internationally recognized territory. They are fighting for a society that they have already decided that they are and want to continue on that path. Meaning they don't want to be a corrupt former Soviet-occupied with the leftovers of the mafia tendencies that we see in Russia. Part of being sovereign and independent is to be able to make the decisions you want for your citizens. For example, be a member of the European Union and to be a member of NATO. And I think the understanding of that is increasing, although it's becoming more problematic to continue with support.
It seems, as you just articulated, there is, I suppose, like an elite consensus that this is a black and white issue, that this matters for all of Europe. However, I wonder if that elite consensus, again, which we used to have here in the United States, is being eroded in any way in other parts of Europe. I take to your point that the Baltic countries, because they are frontline, remain firm, that the Nordic countries, because of various historic reasons, also remain firm, but other countries are kind of getting a little wobbly.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. And I think what political leaders also have to do is to be honest about the threat, honest about their assessment on what will happen if Russia gets away with what it's doing. And I think we sometimes speak to our voters not being frank enough and honest enough. And if we are not honest enough, we can't be surprised when voters are like, I mean, does it really matter? I mean, I would rather spend the, taxpayers' money on something for my own interest domestically rather than supporting a country which, my country doesn't even share borders with. But if we are truly honest about the risk assessment and the obvious threats, I think that would also make a difference. And then we really need courageous leaders. And I think we have to understand that, the time of complacency is over. Time of making comfortable decisions, that is also over. And yes, it does cost money, but it's always better to pay your insurance rather than, ending up in a situation where you didn't do that, and that would be very costly, not only with financial sacrifices, but in human lives and freedom.
So this is not a question I'd ask you if you were a sitting foreign minister, but you're out of government, so suppose you could speak freely now. Who are some of the courageous leaders outside of Ukraine today that you think are holding the line or making the arguments that you just made to their constituents in meaningful ways?
I mean, of course, what comes to mind are also for example, my colleagues. I mean, we have some very vocal former ministers for foreign affairs.
Well, isn't that the problem, though? They're
yeah,
former.
But, of course.
And that's kind of what I was getting to. That it seems that
they were also
there's
at
been
the
this
time.
erosion.
But they were also at the time. I mean, today I would say the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, I would say that she's courageous and she's frank and honest and she's leading. In the Nordic countries overall, I mean, in Finland, there the President Alexander Stubb, he speaks on behalf of the country on foreign affairs. You have within the Baltic states and Poland, of course, there is a big support. And it's not only because they share borders, it's also because they've been there. They know what the alternative is. They have, I would say, a deeper understanding of what is worth defending. They know what Ukraine is fighting for, and Ukraine is basically asking to be allowed to go on the same path as Baltic states have done. If you look at the Baltic states 30 years ago and today, I mean, this is a recipe that works, and that's what Ukraine is asking for. So the understanding in that region is not only because of the external threats or the existential threats for them, it's also because they know that this is worth fighting for.
So we're speaking just a few days after the Trump administration approved a weapons package for Ukraine after kind of seesawing back and forth over whether or not such aid would be provided in the first place. That obviously shows kind of the sway that, a big power like the United States has in these kinds of situations, and particularly as it relates to Ukraine. But are there more discrete roles that smaller European countries can play in support of Ukraine that is perhaps independent of whatever kind of mood Donald Trump is in at the moment?
I firmly believe that in a world that is changing, as we see now, we have to, each and every one of us, like each and every citizen basically has to ask itself, what's my role? How can I be a responsible citizen? And what values matters the most to me? And the same goes with countries. And I think, I fully understand, and I'm not naive with the fact that big countries, of course, have their power. But for countries like mine, soft power is the only power we have. But there's nothing soft about soft power. So I think in the times that we're living now, the smaller states will have an increased role in the world. And I think we all have to realize that we all have a role to play and each role is important. And also with the people that have influence, being in politics is a good way to have influence, but there are other roles as well, journalists, think tanks, and just people that can actually influence others and lead by example. And I think we are in a desperate need for courageous individuals that understand that these fundamental freedoms that we have, we can never take them for granted. And the rule-based order and the system that we all stand on is being attacked. And that means that, for example, the private sector cannot say, oh, we do business, you do politics. That's just not the time we're living. The private sector also has to be ready to fight for what is right and take a stand.
Well, Thordis, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.